Unit 0 Science Practices. This first unit focuses on current psychological perspectives and the research methods psychologists use to gather data about human thinking and behavior. You will find the content from this unit in the textbook you use in your AP Psychology class in the History and Research Methods chapters. Note that the research methods concepts you learn in this unit are important throughout the rest of the curriculum. On the AP test, you will be asked to apply research methods to answer multiple choice questions from each unit and in the free response questions. 1. History of Psychology, Learning Objectives. In this chapter, you will learn about psychological perspectives. Psychological perspectives. Different contemporary psychologists look at human thought and behavior from different perspectives. Contemporary perspectives can be placed into 8 broad categories. Humanist perspective. Humanists, including theorists Abraham Maslow, 1908 to 1970, and Carl Rogers, 1902 to 1987, stressed individual choice and free will. This contrasts with the deterministic behaviorists, who theorize that all behaviors are caused by past conditioning. Humanists believe that we choose most of our behaviors and that these choices are guided by physiological, emotional, or spiritual needs. A humanistic psychologist might explain that an introverted person may choose to limit social contact with others because he or she finds that social needs are better satisfied by contact with a few close friends rather than large groups. Humanistic theories are not easily tested by the scientific method. Some psychological historians view them as more historical perspectives than current ones. However, some therapists find humanistic ideas helpful in aiding clients to overcome obstacles in their lives. Psychodynamic perspective. The psychodynamic perspective continues to be a part of modern psychology, albeit a controversial one. Psychologists using this perspective believe that the unconscious mind, a part of our mind that we do not have conscious control over or access to, controls much of our thought and action. Psychoanalysts look for impulses or memories pushed into the unconscious mind through repression. This perspective suggests that to understand human thought and behavior, we must examine our unconscious mind through dream analysis, word association, and other psychoanalytic therapy techniques. A psychoanalytic psychologist might explain that an introverted person avoids social situations because of a repressed memory of trauma in childhood involving a social situation, perhaps acute embarrassment or anxiety experienced, but not consciously remembered, at school or a party. Biopsychology, or neuroscience perspective. Biopsychologists explain human thought and behavior strictly in terms of biological processes. Human cognition and reactions might be caused by the effects of our genes, hormones, and neurotransmitters in the brain, or by a combination of all three. A biopsychologist might explain a person's tendency to be extroverted as caused by genes inherited from their parents and the genes' effects on the abundance of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. Biopsychology is a rapidly growing field, and some scientists wonder if the future of psychology might be as a branch of the science of biology. Evolutionary, or Darwinian perspective. Evolutionary psychologists, also sometimes called sociobiologists, examine human thoughts and actions in terms of natural selection. Some psychological traits might be advantageous for survival, and these traits would be passed down from the parents to the next generation. A psychologist using the evolutionary perspective, based on Charles Darwin's 1809 to 1882 theory of natural selection, might explain a person's tendency to be extroverted as a survival advantage. If a person is outgoing, he or she might make friends and allies. These connections could improve the individual's chances of survival, which increases the person's chances of passing this trait for extroversion down to his or her children. The evolutionary perspective is similar to, and in some ways a subset of, the biopsychology perspective. Behavioral perspective. Behaviorists explain human thought and behavior in terms of conditioning. Behaviorists look strictly at observable behaviors and at human and animal responses to different kinds of stimuli. A behaviorist might explain a person's tendency to be extroverted in terms of reward and punishment. Was the person rewarded for being outgoing? Was the person punished for withdrawing from a situation or not interacting with others? A behaviorist would look for environmental conditions that caused an extroverted response in the person. See also Unit 4. Cognitive perspective. Cognitive psychologists examine human thought and behavior in terms of how we interpret, process, and remember environmental events. In this perspective, the rules that we use to view the world are important to understanding why we think and behave the way we do. In Unit 3, you will learn about Jean Piaget's 1896 to 1980 cognitive developmental theory, which focuses on how our cognitions develop in stages as we mature. A cognitive psychologist might explain a person's tendency to be extroverted in terms of how he or she interprets social situations. Does the individual interpret others' offers for conversation as important ways to get to know someone, or as important for his or her own life in some way? To a cognitive psychologist, an extroverted person sees the world in such a way that being outgoing makes sense. Social cultural or sociocultural perspective. Social cultural psychologists look at how our thoughts and behaviors vary among cultures. They emphasize the influence culture has on the way we think and act. A social cultural psychologist might explain a person's tendency to be extroverted by examining his or her culture's rules about social interaction. How far apart do people in this culture usually stand when they have a conversation? How often do people touch each other while interacting? How much value does the culture place on being part of a group versus being an individual? These cultural norms would be important to a sociocultural psychologist in explaining a person's extroversion. Biopsychosocial perspective. This modern perspective acknowledges that human thinking and behavior result from combinations of biological, psychological, psycho, and social factors. Psychologists who emphasize the biopsychosocial perspective view other perspectives as too focused on specific influences on thinking and behavior, sometimes called being reductionistic. A biopsychosocial psychologist would agree with a cognitive psychologist about the influence of how we remember and interpret events, but would point out that biological and social influences are equally responsible for our decisions. The biopsychosocial perspective might explain extroversion by focusing on the combination of several influences: a genetic tendency for extroversion, similar to the biopsychological explanation, how a person has been conditioned toward extroverted behavior, and how social pressures, such as conformity, influence his or her extroverted behaviors. Summary. If you ask psychologists which of these perspectives they most agree with, they might say that each perspective has valid explanations depending on the specific situation. This point of view, sometimes called eclectic, claims that no one perspective has all the answers to the variety of human thought and behavior. Psychologists use various perspectives in their work depending on which point of view fits best with the explanation. In the future, some perspectives might be combined, or new perspectives might emerge as research continues.